What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some Bethesda news in the main form of the Oblivion Remastered patch they've got incoming. But it just so happens it was a busy week for Bethesda, so I figured I'd stuff a couple other things in here as it relates to the Elder Scrolls 6 title and some upcoming updates for Fallout 4. But as I mentioned, the main thing I wanted to talk about here was the upcoming stuff for the Oblivion Remastered patch that they've got on the horizon. If you just happen to have missed it, and honestly it wasn't a huge deal for me personally, Oblivion Remastered recently launched on the Nintendo Switch 2. However, the real big news there was that the Switch 2 version came with a bunch of optimizations that are not in the other versions of the game, and given that a lot of the feedback about Oblivion Remastered was about the performance, people had questions, and Bethesda just said that they are going to bring some of that to the rest of the releases for it, and hopefully get it more stable. And I wanted to talk about what some of those fixes actually were, as nobody was really too keen on getting into details, but I love Oblivion, and I wanted to talk about that more specifically. As I mentioned, there was some other stuff that happened this week, and I should probably touch on that at least briefly. The big one, of course, being that it seems like the title for the next Elder Scrolls, the Elder Scrolls 6, has been roughly figured out, and I gotta say, this was the kind of thing that was a bit uninteresting to me personally, but is also the kind of thing that the second it happens, you see thousands of 15 to 20 minute videos pop up out of nowhere doing a ton of speculation. However, to give the very short version, the current Xbox CEO apparently played an internal demo of the Elder Scrolls 6, said they enjoyed it, and briefly referenced the title by using a bunch of asterisks, giving people the rough number of letters that should be involved in the actual title. And then of course people are going to take that and determine things like the setting and everything else. But most of that is old news. Long story short, due to what appears to be an Easter egg in Starfield and an incredibly improbable mathematical coincidence, it is extraordinarily likely that the title for the next Elder Scrolls game is the Elder Scrolls 6 Sentinels. Sentinel, of course, being the capital of Hammerfell, which itself is sandwiched in between a desert to the south, the northern half of the Iliac Bay above it, and if you've played the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, you should be very familiar with it. It plays a prominent role there. But the thing is, that was almost always the case anyway, because of the trailer and stuff that they dropped way back when. It looked very likely that that was going to be Hammerfell, or maybe High Rock, which is the other half of the Iliac Bay, and truth be told, it may well be both. And that's before you even start talking about all the stuff in Skyrim that points to it being a likely location for a bunch of conflict anyway. But hey, people are understandably excited. I get it. I'm excited for that game too when it eventually releases, but I still think we're a ways off from that, frankly. Moving on a little bit, the other bit of quick news before we get into the Oblivion Remastered stuff. So, just like a day or two ago from the time of this video, it was announced via their official channels that BGS will be rolling out a patch for Fallout 4, which they said is going to focus on general creation improvements. Not exactly sure what that is referring to specifically, presumably some of the stuff with that anniversary edition they dropped, but the obvious reason that they announced this is because here in 2 days, on August 18th, when they drop that patch, it is almost certainly going to break people's mods, which, as always, gets people riled up. I actually talked a little bit about this in my interview with Todd Howard back in March. And so, you know, at least they're aware of the problem, I guess. But it really does seem like a bit of a catch-22 for them, where people want them to update their games, but when they then update them, they have to deal with all the mods and things that breaks. Bit of a rough situation, I would say. Then, of course, there's the thing I actually wanted to talk about, this Oblivion Remastered patch. So, we don't know when this is supposed to be coming for everything else, but the Nintendo Switch version launched back on August 11th, about a week ago, and that launch came with a bunch of fixes to various crashes, as well as some changes to various gameplay issues, and at some undetermined time in the future, they're supposed to be bringing those fixes to other platforms. And so I wanted to talk a little more about what those actually were, because by far and away the biggest flack that Oblivion Remastered gets is definitely the performance, which for a lot of people was underwhelming. I do have to say that for me, it ran pretty great. I actually didn't really have too many problems at all. But I will say I'm not really surprised people had problems, because the nature of that remaster was basically two engines sort of cobbled together, that being the original one, and then Unreal Engine 5 and stuff, which was handling the graphical layer on top of it, which is how they updated the looks and everything. This also made modding that particular game much more difficult. If you're unaware, modding with Unreal Engine 5 is more complicated than it is elsewhere. That's why you don't see a lot of mods for games that use it. And between that and the fact it's a mishmash of the original game as well, the problems are unsurprising, I would say. But what actually are these fixes from the Switch 2 version? Well, let's talk a little bit about them. So first and foremost, we have got roughly 25 or so fixes for just straight up crashes that were a problem. So this includes a crash during the main Light the Dragon's Fire quest. There was a crash that could happen when you open the player menu right outside the Imperial prison, like right as you escape and start the game, so that one would be annoying for people. There was a crash that could happen if you purchased all available spells from a spell vendor. There was a crash that could happen if you purchased a specific bit of meat from a character in the Mystic Emporium. There was apparently a crash that people were having to deal with if you were sprinting in a very specific part of the world, that being around the Nibene Valley area. There was a crash that would happen if you would back out of the save and load menu as you were overwriting or deleting a save, like if you backed out of the menu too fast while that was saving. It could potentially crash on you. There was a crash for the Last Thieves Guild quest if you went to loot enemies during that one, which I am assuming probably has to do with those two statues, which it is difficult but not impossible to loot, as they disappear when they die, but it is technically possible to loot them, so I'm curious if that's the specific thing they were talking about there. There was a crash when you saved inside the Oblivion realms, like the Oblivion gates. If you were to load a quick save in there, there was a chance that would just crash on you. So that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. Just a lot of different fixes to the various crashes people were dealing with, which is of course great. They also fixed a couple of load and save issues when it came to killing the gatekeeper. Basically, if you killed the gatekeeper under very specific circumstances, it could cause problems when you loaded a save. But if that wasn't enough for you, they also changed some more just generic gameplay stuff that could happen as well. So beyond that, they also fixed a variety of other issues with the Nintendo Switch 2 version, those being like Jiggle-Ag just not showing up at the end of Shivering Isles, like you would get to the point in the quest where he's supposed to spawn in and then he just doesn't. They fixed a specific fast travel to the Skingrad Oblivion Gate that would load you inside a texture and leave you unable to move or do anything, of course, as well as a few other issues with fast traveling that would ultimately result in you being pushed out of the map, though that seemed to be a little more specific. Like, for instance, if you were fast traveling on a horse in specific circumstances, there was a chance it would just like kick you off the map. And then a lot of the other stuff was UI issues. For instance, there were some ingredients and things that just wouldn't have a prompt to pick them up, even though you were supposed to be able to do so. Using a pin marker on the map, or the local map specifically, would potentially cause you not to be able to use map icon filters anymore. And I would say most of the other ones in that category were just situations where you could lead to getting the controls locked under certain circumstances. Like, for instance, if you put too many pin markers on a map while you were inside of a city, this could occasionally stop the menus from working. There were issues with touch screens where if you messed around with specific menu navigation options, the touchscreen could become unresponsive, that sort of thing. So all in all, a decent patch when it comes to fixing performance issues, which again were people's main concern with Oblivion Remastered up to this point, because while I got a couple of patches post-release, it kind of just stopped after, I think it was 1.2. And we really haven't heard much about it since, until now, of course. And so, while obviously a lot of the changes I just listed were specific to the Nintendo Switch 2, that does, of course, mean we do have to wonder how much of this, and if anything extra, will then be brought forward and added on to whatever they bring for other platforms. There's also, of course, how much longer is it going to continue to take? A lot of questions there, obviously, but ultimately, I'm still glad to see that they are planning on doing something with this. Obviously, the performance problems that have been encountered by people were an issue, and as somebody who really loves Oblivion, obviously I want people to experience it in the best way possible, and to that end, hopefully this goes some way to addressing that when they ultimately wind up dropping that patch, which admittedly has honestly been too long. But that, I suppose, is just about going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. By all means, let me know how you feel about all this down in the comment section below, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.